Alright, thank you for the introduction. Can everybody hear me? Thank you for the introduction, ladies and gentlemen. As we all know, compared to our crystalline materials, our commonly used metals and alloys that are primarily based on either one or two main elements, high entropy alloys present somewhat like a new class of alloys where multiple elements coexist in equiatomic or at least near equiatomic compositions. While most of them, as per definition, are crystallized with simple crystal structures, some of them can be single-phase materials, of which this chrome, manganese, cobalt, iron, cobalt, nickel alloy is probably the most well-known one. The material itself was first identified in 2004 by Brian Cantor and his co-workers, who has done nothing else than throwing all kinds of different elements together to see what materials he can come up with. And what was interesting about this combination of elements was that it had a past dendritic structure but was a single-phase FCC material. A few years later, when our now collaborator Iso George got interested in this single-phase FCC materials, he first of all wanted to identify that this was really a single-phase material. So he arc melted and drop cast the same combination of elements and then heat treated it subsequently for 72 hours, so basically 3 days at 1000 C, just to be able to say that Brian Cantor was right, everything is correct, that this is a single-phase material, but due to this long-term heat treatment, he was also able to say this was a stable single-phase material. So now that Iso had already this material lying around, he got kind of curious about the properties of this alloy and this material, so he processed it to different microstructures between 5 and 150 microns. As we can see, after processing from our SEM, EBSD, and TEM images, we had a homogeneous equiax grade structures in all cases. There were a large number of annealing twins after recrystallization. From the EBSD scans, we can clearly see that this was only weakly, if at all, texture. And of course, it was a single-phase microstructure, and the grains were, after recrystallizing, basically dislocation-free. In terms of mechanical properties, Iso has done a lot of tensile tests on all three different grain sizes, basically over a wide temperature range from 800 C all the way down to liquid nitrogen temperature, and found a very strong temperature dependence of both strength and the ductility, with the highest ductilities to obviously occur at the lowest temperatures, which is likely caused by the prevention of necking. As we can see here, at these lower temperatures there was no necking obvious, whereas at elevated temperatures there was quite a bit of necking that he found. The highest degree of work hardening also obviously occurred at the lowest temperatures, which is obvious from the difference here between tensile and yield strength. The yield strength approximately doubles from room temperature down to liquid nitrogen temperature, which is probably associated with thermally activated yielding. For such thermally activated yielding process, however, it's somewhat unusual that there was no sensitivity to strain rate changes, as we can see here. The deformation itself was at lower strains, identified to be carried mainly by planar dislocation slip on 111 planes in 110 direction. This occurred at all temperatures, whereas at the lower temperatures, at the higher strains, above 20% strains, we got, in addition to planar dislocation slip, also nanoscale deformation twinning. At this point, when Iso presented these results at a DOE meeting in Washington a few years ago, my boss Rob Ritchie got kind of curious about this material, so that we decided to collaborate with Iso George, and we have decided to go do our test and look at samples that contain a crack on samples that had a grain size of about 6 microns, simply because we can keep our samples a little smaller and still be valid. So we Iso processed the material to 6 microns. Again, we had an equiatomic single-phase material, equiax grains, also numerous recrystallization twins. The elastic properties were measured using resonant ultrasound spectroscopy in the range room temperature down to liquid nitrogen temperatures now were found to be about 200 to 250 GPa, and the Poisson's ratio was about 0.26 to 0.27. For the specific microstructure, we had to, of course, also measure the mechanical properties, now only from room temperature to liquid nitrogen temperature, found an increase in yield strength from 400 to 760 MPa, tensile strength from 760 to 1300 MPa, and the failure strain increased from 0.6 to 0.7, which is basically a 25% increase in failure strain, 70% in tensile strength, and 85% increase in yield strength. The strain hardening exponent was measured to be about 0.4 constant. When we started with our fracture toughness measurements, we decided to make such compact tension specimen, nicely sized compact tension specimen, rather on the larger size for what we are normally doing. They had a W of 18 millimeter and a sample thickness of about 9 millimeter. All the samples were machined by EDM. The surfaces were subsequently, of course, polished with silicon carbide paper. Then we pre-cracked the samples in tension at an RO1 and side-proofed subsequently the samples in order to increase the constraint at the crack tip, and did our testing again at room temperature. At this intermediate temperature, that is nothing else than a bath of dry ice and alcohol, and then at liquid nitrogen temperature. When we look at the results of these tests, we can see such nice crack resistance curve behavior, this time in terms of the J integral on the y-axis over the crack extension, of course. We see a significant increase in crack propagation resistance at first crack extensions, followed by a somewhat shallower increase all the way up to above 300 MPa root meter at the maximum crack extension allowed for this size of geometry and sizes of samples at about 2.5 millimeter, 2.25 millimeter. At the intersection with the blunting lines, we measured at room temperature a fracture toughness of impressively 220 MPa root meter, which, and this is the nice thing about this material, this remains stable, high, down to liquid nitrogen temperature, where we measured essentially the same fracture toughness, and we have to keep in mind at the same time strength and ductility go up. In order to understand now how this material gets such excellent properties, we have of course done some fructography after testing. So we took one sample from each temperature, basically cycled it to complete failure so that we can fully investigate the fracture surfaces. We can nicely see here our notch that we made by EDM, our pre-crack, our side grooves, the overload fracture zone, and of course in the back of the sample our fatigue region. When we zoom into the fracture surface, this was the same for all three different temperatures. We get fully ductile improved fracture with a lot of voids, but also a lot of such particles all over the fracture surface. We have tried to do some statistical analysis on these particles, found an average particle size of about 1.6 microns and an average spacing of about 50 microns, even though that these numbers should probably be taken with a grain of salt, as it's not that simple to really do good statistical analysis of so many particles. We have done some EDX analysis though and found that they are either chrome-rich or manganese-rich. We think that they are oxides from processing of the material, which is quite common, particularly as manganese is known to be very keen to oxygen. And when we take manganese out, then this oxide and these particles, they disappear to a large extent. In order to get now to the mechanisms that lead to such high fracture toughnesses, we have taken two samples from the two extreme temperatures, one at room temperature and one at liquid nitrogen temperature, and sliced them along the half, basically in the middle of the sample, embedded them both in conductive and non-conductive resin, and have done then a lot of microscopy in the vicinity of the propagated crack in the center of the sample, where we have full plane strain conditions. As you can see from our liquid nitrogen and room temperature secondary electron images, we can get basically the same result. We get very nice, fully ductile fracture with void formation ahead of the crack and void coalescence. In both cases, maybe in the liquid nitrogen case, a little bit more deviation, but other than that, these are basically the same at both temperatures. When we look at the scans that we have done using electron backscatter diffraction and backscattered electron, we can see that particularly from our EDSD images that we get a lot of plastic deformation disorientations within basically every grain in the vicinity of the propagated crack. We also see a lot of such recrystallization twins and maybe a few such nanoscale deformation twins, even though they were extremely hard to find at room temperature, so that we think we can clearly say that at room temperature, like in the case of the tensile strength, the deformation is mainly carried by planar dislocation slip and by dislocation motion. When we look at the sample that was tested at liquid nitrogen temperature, we can see a similar picture to some extent. We also get a lot of such deformation cells within every individual grains. We get pronounced cell structures, a lot of dislocation activity, but also in addition to that, we get a lot of such nanoscale deformation basically in every individual grain, which becomes even more obvious when we overlay this EBSD scan now with an image quality map of the same region, and particularly it becomes clear when we look at our BSE images in the vicinity of the propagated crack. Here in the background, obvious, we can see that nanoscale deformation twinning is obvious everywhere close to the crack. After these results, after we got these quite exciting and amazing results, we got a little worried that the numbers were maybe a little bit too high, so we decided to get a second measurement, an independent assessment of the fracture toughness that we have measured. For that we used a technique called stereophotogrammetry, which allows us, compared to the global measurements that we have done at the beginning, to very locally measure the crack initiation toughness in the center of the sample at the first physical crack extensions, basically at the intersection of the pre-crack via stretch zone to the overload fracture zone. The technique works in that way that we basically take two fracture surfaces, put them inside the SEM and take images under two different angles, which are then overlaid with such a reconstruction software. So we create a 3D digital surface model, which we then use to put such multiple arbitrary crack paths at this intersection from fatigue pre-crack, overload stretching zone and overload fracture zone, and then we need to find exactly the same crack paths on the second fracture surface, which is the tedious and very time-consuming work, and this is really a lot of work to do. However, what this gives us is basically a height profile of each fracture surface that we can then put together and go back to the initial situation before we start pulling on the sample. We can then nicely see our pre-crack, our stretch zone, and once we start pulling the sample, our crack basically opens and we can go to the point where our pre-crack coalesces with the first void ahead of the crack tip and can nicely and conveniently measure the crack tip open displacement, which we have of course done for multiple, at least 10 different such profiles on both room temperature samples and liquid nitrogen temperature samples, and ended up with crack tip open displacement of about 57 microns for the room temperature sample and 49 microns for the liquid nitrogen sample, which using H's relation we can then back calculate into a J, and the standard JK equivalent gives us basically a crack initiation toughness at a delta K of 0, basically the first physical crack extensions where we measured 190 and 200 MPa root beta at room temperature and liquid nitrogen temperature respectively, which fits quite well and matches quite well the numbers that we have measured globally. And with that, I'm already coming to the conclusion. We've seen that these high entropy alloys are a quite fascinating class of materials and present kind of a new aspect of metallurgy in the quest of new materials that can give us quite interesting properties. We've seen that particularly this 5-component alloy, single-phase material, is extremely damage tolerant, not just at room temperature, all the way down to liquid nitrogen temperature. We get very large strengths and fracture toughness numbers through planar dislocation slip and nanoscale deformation twinning at the lower temperatures, which kind of gives us a very high strain hardening exponent, prevents nagging, and that way we get quite up here to the top of typical metals and alloys, where these materials compare quite favorably to the best austenitic stainless steel that we have today, and also cryogenic steels. And with that, I'm at the end, and thank you all for your attention.